If you look at the statistics of 1943, the liberation of Europe looked like a mathematical impossibility. The Luftwaffe wasn't just defending their skies, they were systematically destroying Allied bomber streams. History stood on a knife's edge, waiting for a protector that could finally go the distance. You may know the name of the aircraft that changed everything, but the real story is how one little friend ignored every rule of engagement and quietly broke the back of Hitler's Air Force. This is the moment the tide of the air war turned forever. After the arrival of the P-51 Mustang, the Luftwaffe discovered that the safe skies over Germany had vanished forever. Many of us grew up hearing the legend of the Flying Fortress, that bristling silver beast that was supposed to be invulnerable. In the early 1940s, the American High Command truly believed that if you packed enough .50 caliber machine guns into a tight enough formation, no fighter on Earth could touch it. It was a comforting thought, wasn't it? The idea that American grit and heavy plating could simply brute force its way to Berlin. The reality of 1943 was a cold, oxygen-thin nightmare that the history books often gloss over. We sent those boys up in B-17s and B-24s, trusting in the Fortress moniker, only to find that the Luftwaffe's Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s weren't just participating in an air war, they were conducting a slaughter. Without a protector that could go the distance, our bombers were essentially tethered to a death sentence the moment their short-range escorts turned back at the German border. The records from that era show a grim reality where the math simply didn't add up. During the second raid on Schweinfurt, we lost 60 bombers in a single afternoon. That isn't just a statistic, that's 600 men gone in a few hours of screaming metal and frozen air. The unlimited power of strategic bombing had hit a wall of German steel. Therefore, the entire Allied war effort sat on a knife's edge. We had the bombs and the brave men to carry them. We simply lacked the one thing that could actually get them home. The myth of the self-defending bomber had died in the clouds over Germany. Unless someone found a way to bridge the gap, the liberation of Europe was a dream we couldn't afford to keep dreaming. To move forward, we have to look at the workhorse that was already on the field. Many of us hold a deep respect for the P-47 Thunderbolt, the Jug. It was a masterpiece of American industrial might, built like a brick wall and powered by a radial engine that could swallow a 20 shell and keep turning. If you were a pilot in 1943, there was no cockpit you'd rather be sitting in when the tracers started flying. For all its ruggedness and its 850 caliber guns, the Thunderbolt carried a fatal flaw that wasn't about its armor or its armament, it was about its leash. When we look at the tactical charts of the time, it becomes clear that the air war over Europe was essentially a game of miles, not just maneuvers. The P-47 was a thirsty beast. Even with the early external drop tanks, its combat radius was strictly limited. To an aging veteran or a student of history, the math is heartbreaking. The Jug could protect the bombers as far as the German border, or perhaps a bit into the Ruhr Valley. Then the fuel gauges would dip into the red. The pilots would have to waggle their wings, a silent, painful salute to the bomber crews, and turn back toward England. It's hard to imagine the gut punch those B-17 crews felt, watching their little friends peel away into the clouds, leaving them alone in the Great Gap. The Luftwaffe knew this math better than we did. They would simply sit back, circling like vultures just beyond the range of the P-47s, waiting for the escorts to depart. The moment the Thunderbolts turned for home, the German controllers would vector hundreds of fighters into the bomber streams. We tried everything to stretch that tether. We experimented with larger, unpressurized paper tanks that leaked or failed to feed at high altitudes. We tried flying the P-47 slower to save fuel, which only made them sitting ducks for the faster Messerschmitts. The reality was stark. The Thunderbolt was a world-class gladiator, but it was a gladiator chained to a short post. Therefore, by the end of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces were facing a strategic catastrophe. We were winning the battles, but losing the war of attrition because we couldn't stay in the fight long enough to finish it. We needed a miracle. Not just a faster plane, but a plane with the heart of a marathon runner and the soul of a sprinter. We needed a marriage of technologies that hadn't even met yet. The crisis of 1943 had reached a breaking point, but as many of us have seen in our own lives, the greatest breakthroughs often come from the most unlikely of pairings. At the time, the North American P-51 was already in service, but it wasn't the legend we know today. In its early form, it was a sleek, low-altitude Scout powered by the Allison engine. A reliable American power plant, certainly, but one that gasped for air the moment it climbed above 15,000 feet. It was a racehorse with a head cold. But history suggests that the salvation of the 8th Air Force didn't come from a new blueprint, but from a cross-Atlantic marriage of necessity. The British, always keen on refined engineering, looked at the Mustang's laminar flow wing, a design that cut through the air like a hot knife through butter, and realized it was being held back by its own heart. They suggested dropping in the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same mechanical masterpiece that powered the Spitfire. Think of it like taking a lightweight, precision-balanced chassis and dropping a high-performance supercharged V12 under the hood. When the American Packard Company began mass-producing that Merlin engine under license, the result was the P-51B and later the iconic D model. It wasn't just an improvement, it was a fundamental shift in the physics of the war. The strategic crisis of 1943 boiled down to two desperate requirements: altitude and range. The payoff arrived with the Merlin's two-stage supercharger. Suddenly, the Mustang didn't just fly, it screamed. It could maintain high horsepower at 30,000 feet, exactly where the B-17s were most vulnerable and struggling to maintain formation. The real breakthrough, the fact that changed everything, was the aircraft's newfound efficiency. By pairing that Merlin engine with massive internal fuel tanks and the ability to carry external wing tanks, the Mustang's range tripled. This wasn't just a mechanical upgrade, it was a geographic revolution that finally allowed Allied fighters to shadow their bombers deep into the heart of the Reich. Many of us remember the famous, perhaps apocryphal quote from Hermann Goering: "The day I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." He wasn't just being dramatic. Before the Mustang, Berlin was a sanctuary for the Luftwaffe. After the Merlin Mustang arrived, there was nowhere left to hide. Until the Mustang arrived, German interceptors could simply wait for Allied escorts to turn back, but now the hunters were being followed all the way home. However, this marriage of British elegance and American muscle didn't just give us a long-range Scout, it gave us a Predator. The Mustang was faster than the Bf-109 and more maneuverable at high altitudes than the FW-190. It turned the Great Gap, where our bombers used to die, into a killing field for German interceptors. The Mustang didn't just accompany the bombers, it hunted for them. Therefore, the arrival of the P-51 wasn't just a tactical update, it was the moment the leash was finally cut. The little friends weren't just staying for the first half of the fight, they were staying for the finish. By early 1944, the arrival of the Merlin-powered Mustang didn't just change the odds, it fundamentally rewrote the rules of engagement over the Third Reich. For years, the Luftwaffe's elite Abbeville kids and veteran interceptor wings had operated with a sense of predatory entitlement. They would wait for Allied escorts to turn back, then they would fall upon the combat boxes of B-17s like wolves among sheep. It was a calculated, cold-blooded tactical advantage. But history suggests that the German pilots were in for a psychological shock that many of us can scarcely imagine. Imagine being a Messerschmitt pilot, watching the P-47s and P-38s peel away as usual, beginning your dive toward the heavy bombers, only to realize that a new, sleeker silhouette wasn't leaving. In fact, it was climbing to meet you. The tactical dilemma for the Allies had always been the Luftwaffe's ability to trade altitude for speed by diving from 35,000 feet, catching our bombers in a high-speed pass before they could react. The Mustang provided the definitive answer with its incredible high-altitude performance. Because of that laminar flow wing and the two-stage supercharged Packard Merlin engine, the P-51 didn't just keep up, it dominated the thin air where the bombers lived. The hunters had suddenly become the hunted, finding themselves caught in a dogfight with a plane that actually gained strength where their own engines began to struggle. The 8th Air Force commander, General Jimmy Doolittle, issued a famous aggressive order: identify the enemy and destroy him. He didn't want the Mustangs just sitting next to the bombers like nervous bodyguards. He wanted them roaming. He unleashed the Mustangs to fly miles ahead of the bomber streams, clearing the rafters of German fighters before they could even form up. The shift in tactics brought about immediate and devastating results. During the opening months of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 1,000 pilots, many of them irreplaceable veterans who had survived the Battle of Britain and the brutal campaigns on the Eastern Front. A Mustang pilot, positioned behind that iconic bubble canopy with 360-degree visibility, possessed a tactical advantage that was hard to overstate. From miles away, he could spot a German interceptor, initiate a dive at over 400 miles per hour, and be firmly on the enemy's tail before the German pilot even realized he was in a fight. This newfound dominance meant the German fighters were no longer safe even within their own airspace. The Mustang didn't just escort bombers, it aggressively cleared the sky, forcing the Luftwaffe into a defensive crouch from which it would never truly recover. Therefore, the bloody skies of 1943 began to clear, not through a ceasefire, but through systematic aerial execution. The Mustang was no longer just a little friend, it was an executioner. The German pilots, once the masters of the European sky, found that their cockpits had become coffins. Every time they took off, they knew the Mustangs were already up there, waiting in the sun, with enough fuel to follow them all the way back to their own runways. By the spring of 1944, the structural integrity of the Luftwaffe wasn't just cracking, it was dissolving. It's a common misconception that the German Air Force was simply outproduced by American factories. While our industrial might was staggering, the real purple value of the Mustang was how it facilitated the great attrition. The Luftwaffe wasn't just losing planes, it was losing its soul. The experienced pilots who possessed the fingertip feel for aerial combat. The specific problem the Germans faced was a lack of space. In the earlier years of the war, a German pilot could retreat to the interior of the Reich to refit and train. But the Mustang changed the geography of the war. With its massive internal fuel capacity, the P-51 could loiter over German training airfields. The Mustang's greatest victory wasn't found exclusively in the dogfights at 30,000 feet, but in the strafing runs that followed. After the bombers dropped their payloads and the high-altitude threat was neutralized, these fighters would drop down to the deck, becoming a low-level terror. They hunted everything that moved: locomotives, oil refineries, and especially the inexperienced German cadets trying to learn how to fly in a sky that was no longer theirs. There is a brutal logic to war that many of us understand. To win, you must destroy the enemy's ability to replenish. By targeting the pilots and the fuel before they could even reach the front, the Mustang didn't just win the air war, it strangled the Luftwaffe in its cradle. The total collapse of German air defense during the D-Day landings stood as a testament to this persistent pressure. On June 6, 1944, the day that decided the fate of Western Europe, the Luftwaffe was almost entirely absent from the skies. Out of the thousands of Allied sorties flown that day, only a handful of German fighters managed to even reach the beaches. The long shadow of the Mustang had effectively neutralized the most sophisticated air defense network in history. The influence of this aircraft extended far beyond the surrender in 1945. For those of us who appreciate the evolution of engineering, the Mustang represents the pinnacle of the piston engine era. It served as the vital bridge to the jet age. Even as the first Me-262 jets appeared in the sky, the Mustang proved that a well-flown prop plane could still hold its own against the future. The P-51 stayed in service through the Korean War, proving its worth as a rugged ground attack aircraft long after it had finished its job as a high-altitude escort. The ghost of the Luftwaffe wasn't just haunted by the planes they lost, but by the realization that they had been technologically and strategically outclassed. The Mustang didn't just fly further, it stayed longer, fought harder, and redefined what an escort fighter could be. It became the yardstick by which all other fighters would be measured for a generation. As we look back through the lens of history, we see many aircraft that were faster, larger, or more heavily armed than the P-51. But for those of us who appreciate the marriage of form and function, the Mustang remains in a category of its own. It wasn't just a machine, it was the ultimate expression of American industrial ingenuity at the exact moment the world needed it most. It arrived as a little friend to the terrified crews of the 8th Air Force and left as the undisputed sovereign of the skies. The enduring legacy of the Mustang isn't found in its top speed or its kill count, but in its history of liberation. Every B-17 that returned to a fog-shrouded English runway and every crewman who walked away to grow old and tell his story owes a debt to that sleek silhouette. The crisis of 1943, the Great Gap, was solved by a plane that refused to turn back. Today, when we see a restored Mustang at an air show, the whistle of its gun ports and the roar of the Merlin engine still command a unique kind of silence from the crowd. It's a salute to a generation that didn't just build a better tool, but a symbol of endurance. Therefore, the Mustang doesn't just belong to the museums or the history books, it lives on in the freedom of the very skies it once cleared. It remains the Cadillac of the skies, a testament to the fact that when elegance meets muscle, history changes course. Today, when we see a restored Mustang at an air show, the whistle of its gun ports and the roar of the Merlin engine still command a unique kind of silence from the crowd. It's a salute to a generation that didn't just build a better tool, but a symbol of endurance. Therefore, the Mustang doesn't just belong to the museums or the history books, it lives on in the freedom of the very skies it once cleared. It remains the Cadillac of the skies, a testament to the fact that when elegance meets muscle, history changes course. This was not just a victory of engineering, it was the moment the Luftwaffe realized the war in the air could no longer be won. If you believe that the stories of these men and their machines deserve to be told with the respect and detail they've earned, I'd be honored to have you join our community. This channel is dedicated to preserving that legacy, but we can't do it alone. By subscribing and hitting the notification bell, you're helping ensure these chapters of our shared history aren't forgotten by the generations to come. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Perhaps you have a personal connection to the 8th Air Force or a memory of seeing a Mustang in flight that you'd like to share. Your likes and shares help us reach more people who value this history as much as you do. Thank you for your time, your stories, and for keeping the spirit of these legends alive.